Last week, the Archdiocese of Washington announced that the celebration of the traditional Latin Mass in parishes throughout the Archdiocese will no longer be permitted. In a decree published Friday, Cardinal Wilton Gregory mandated that beginning September 21st, Sunday Mass can only be said using the old rite at 3 non-parish churches. Priests who want to celebrate the Latin Mass have to request permission in writing and affirm the validity of the revisions implemented during the Second Vatican Council. Also, among the provisions of the 7-page document is Cardinal Gregory's requirement that the clergy of Washington ask his permission in order to say the ordinary form of the liturgy, ad orientem, facing east or away from the people. Here to discuss all of this and more is Associate Professor of Theology at the Catholic University of America, Chad Pecknold, and Senior Fellow at the St. Paul Institute for Biblical Theology, PETER KWASNIEWSKI. Thank you both for being here. Chad, the Archdiocese of Chicago made similar changes earlier this year. Are you surprised by Cardinal Gregory's decision to ban the traditional Latin Mass, and why now?
I mean, I'm so heartbroken, but I'm not surprised. It's I think, as you mentioned, both in Chicago and D.C., we had long rumored the most draconian implementation of the motu proprio. I never believed the rumors. I thought, well, it won't be that draconian, but in fact, it was more draconian than I even anticipated, as you already suggested. Traditionis Custodes does not actually restrict ad orientem, but of course in the implementation here, he takes that to be the spirit of the law. It's devastating for so many faithful Catholics in the Archdiocese of Washington who make lots of sacrifices and are maybe the most engaged in the sacramental life of the Church, at a time in which we see sacramental participation declining. So why? Yeah. Why be so draconian in your approach to the implementation of this executive order?
Yeah, well, the ban on the old rite or the traditional Latin Mass follows a ruling last year, which you mentioned, in which Pope Francis severely limited the use of that old rite. Now, Francis suggested that those who preferred the Latin Mass were using it to reinforce ideological divisions within the Church. Cardinal Gregory of D.C. said he had not found that to be the case in D.C., writing, quote, "I've discovered that the majority of the faithful who participate in these liturgical celebrations in the Archdiocese of Washington are sincere, faith-filled, and well-meaning. Likewise, the majority of priests who celebrate these liturgies are doing their very best to respond pastorally to the needs of the faithful." Peter, if this is the case, why ban a couple of these traditional Latin Masses, particularly in a place like Old St. Mary's, where I used to go to church, and it was instrumental in my wife's conversion? And I'll talk to you in a moment about it. I know you were associated with that parish at one time as well.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, again, I think that it's significant that Cardinal Gregory has a degree in liturgy. He is somebody who is fully committed to not just the liturgical reform in a generic way, because I think all of us might say, well, we're interested in liturgical renewal and we want everybody to participate deeply in the liturgy and so on, all the ideals that you find in Vatican II. But he's committed specifically to the way in which the implementation took place in the 60s and 70s, all the way down to the present. So I think that he's fundamentally unsympathetic with Catholics, even who find the old rite spiritually nourishing and fulfilling and dynamic for their life of faith. It's almost as if the attitude is, you either must learn to love and worship with this new rite. It doesn't matter what your personal experiences are, or tough luck. We're going to impose a new set of Jim Crow laws, and we're going to force segregation of Catholics into separate but unequal categories.
Wow. No, I have to tell you, I was traveling last week, and we went to a couple of masses as we were traveling. If there were one version of the Novus Ordo, if there's one version of the Reformed Mass, you'd say, okay, well, we will do this. We'll show up and participate in this. But It's a cacophony. Not one is nothing like the others in music, in tone, even the procession in, the procession out. Everything is fungible and movable and improvisatory. The Latin Mass doesn't have that, which is, I think, the attraction of the young to that. And you mentioned a moment ago about people participating in the Mass. The first obligation is to get them to show up. And I think that's going to become increasingly difficult when you sap the Mass of sacrality, wonder, awe, which the old Mass has because of the form itself. Chad, I was struck by the fact that the Pope embraced all matter of native embellishments around the Mass during his Canadian visit. He even said, and I'm going to quote and get your reaction to this, he said, "In the fog of forgetfulness that overshadows our turbulent times, it is essential to cultivate our roots, to pray for and with our forebearers, to dedicate time to remember and guard their legacy. This is how a family tree grows. This is how the future is built," end quote. Yet the traditional Mass and our forebearers has become something disposable, I guess. How does that add up?
Well, it doesn't add up, Raymond, and we all know it doesn't add up. And the question is why do we have so much incoherence? And I think one explanation is in Rome, they're in a hurry. They're in a hurry to send a lot of signals, and they're sending those signals, and the signals are, that anything that is traditional or deemed conservative, whatever that might mean, is to be marginalized and ghettoized, and whatever is progressive or forward-thinking is to be perhaps tolerated, perhaps debatable, even celebrated. And it, I think, is reflective of a curia that is in a hurry to send an ideological message, and this is what I think happens with a really kind of vicious politicization of the Mass.
In a letter to Cardinal Gregory, Father Vincent de Rosa said his parish, Old St. Mary's in Chinatown, would struggle to survive if the Latin Mass parishioners left and took their donations elsewhere. He wrote, "To lose half our population overnight would put our finances at least 130,000 in the red, crush our volunteer base, and seriously hamper our ability to proclaim Christ here." Peter, you used to direct the Gregorian chant Scola at Old St. Mary's in D.C. when you were a grad student. How much of a blow is this decision to forbid the old rite to this parish and to the community there? And what do you think will become of Old St. Mary's?
Yeah, it's a huge blow. I mean, I love St. Mary's. I have very fond memories of singing up in the choir loft there and seeing how crowded it was downstairs and how many families. And I've heard it's only become more and more filled with families since the time I was there. I was there in the mid-90s as a graduate student. No, I mean, from what I've been told by my friends, the Latin Mass was the mainstay of that parish, as indeed it was of other parishes in the Washington, D.C. area. St. Mary's is not the only one that's going to suffer. St. Francis de Sales is also going to suffer a great deal. I actually think about a historical parallel. Bishop John Ireland in the 19th century treated Eastern Rite Catholics as second-class citizens, and he persecuted their clergy. I think this is what we're seeing today with Cupich and Gregory is the worst treatment of Catholics by Catholics since Bishop John Ireland in the 19th century.
Absolutely.
It's terrible. Chad, as we approach the Bishop's Synod on Synodality, do you expect that we're going to see other dioceses shutting down the Latin Mass to appear to be in communion with the Holy See?
I'm afraid so, because, while I'm long-term hopeful, Raymond, because I think the demographic wins are sort of on the side of tradition. I mean, when you look at those who are most highly invested in going to Mass, even if they're not Latin Mass goers, they're young people who respect the grandeur of it and who are maybe anti-TLMers. But I think, look, law is a teacher. And the Pope has promulgated a law that is set on undoing Summorum Pontificum, undoing the sort of regularization of the 1962 Missal, and that is going to have a chilling effect. It just is going to have a chilling effect. And, as my friend Chris Ruddy at CUA says, this is going to be a severe pruning. But as Jesuits should know, suppressions almost always backfire. And I think this is a suppression that's going to backfire big time, and that after a severe pruning, we're going to get a great flowering, or that's my hope and prayer.
Well, I mean, to use a musical analogy that's probably a little off, just because I prefer jazz, which I do, doesn't mean we should outlaw opera, which I occasionally attend. And I feel that way about the Mass. We should be allowed to take in all the flowers of Catholicism, including the old rite and the Eastern rites and the Novus Ordo.
Right. Well, what do we say to
I don't know why this is so controversial.
What do we say to the Eastern Catholics? Are the Eastern Catholics, who worship ad orientem, are they doing something wrong? Is there some defect? I think we have just massive incoherence that needs to be reconciled, perhaps under a future papacy.
Last week, the Vatican issued another warning of a new schism coming out of the synodal way in Germany. They wrote, and it was an unsigned critique, the synodal way in Germany does not have the power to compel bishops and the faithful to adopt new forms of governance and new orientations of doctrines and morals. It would not be permissible to introduce new official structures or doctrines in dioceses before an agreement had been reached at the level of the universal church, which would constitute a violation of ecclesial communion and a threat to the unity of the church. The Holy See said it seemed necessary to clarify this in order to, quote, safeguard the freedom of the people of God and the exercise of episcopal ministry. The German synodal way is a controversial process. It was initiated by Cardinal Reinhard Marx, and its focus has been revolutionizing the priesthood, the role of women, sexual morality. Most recently, an organizer of the German process said the synodal way wanted to change the church's teaching on homosexuality, and it called for blessings of same-sex unions. Peter, what do you make of the Vatican's warning to the church in Germany, and is it clear enough, and is it timely enough?
Yes, I'm afraid I have a bit of cynicism over this matter for a few reasons. One is that the Vatican has been sending mixed signals of its own for years now. All we have to do, we have such short memories in modern times. All we have to do is go back to the 2014-2015 synods on the family, the Extraordinary Synod followed by the Ordinary Synod, which caused so much furor in the church because it seemed as if the indissolubility of marriage was being called into question, and even the heterosexual nature of marriage was being raised as a topic for debate at a synod in the Vatican, right? And then similarly, Cardinal Hollerich has been appointed as one of the main steerers of the Synod on Synodality, which is coming up next year. And he is openly and outspokenly a proponent of women's ordination and of homosexual recognition in the church of homosexual unions. So you have to ask, is this some kind of elaborate ballet? I mean, are the Germans just going too far, too fast? Notice this phrase, before an agreement had been reached. I mean, as if the Vatican is saying, well, what you're saying is okay if we agreed with it, but you're going too fast on your own. It seems to me to be kind of a competition of pushing the envelope. Who pushes the envelope where and how fast?
Yeah. No, it feels like a political operation. I mean, as somebody who's covered D.C. for years, this feels like a political, you float the balloon in one municipality, and then it becomes the talking point for the whole party and soon a national policy. Now, following the statement by the Holy See on Thursday, the presidents of the German Bishops' Conference and that central committee of so-called German Catholics, they said they were stunned by the intervention from the Vatican, saying, quote, in our understanding, a synodal process is something else. This also applies to the way today's communication has been handled, which has been a source of astonishment to us. It's not a good example of communication within the church. If statements are published which are not signed by name, unfortunately, the synodal committee has not been invited to a discussion with Vatican bodies to date. And that was Bishop Georg Batzing of Limburg. Chad, your thoughts on this German pushback? The organizers of the German Synodal Way have been previously warned that they're going in a direction that's not in communion with the universal church. Why are they astonished by this reaction from Rome?
I mean, I think it's faux astonishment. The drama that's playing out, as Peter rightly said, goes back to Amoris Laetitia, goes back to the Synod on the Family. I mean, I think it's telling that Cardinal Casper has stated his concern about Germany. That's both good. He's no conservative, and he's expressing concern about German schism, but it's also deeply, deeply ironic, since it is actually the arguments of Cardinal Kasper advancing communion for those who are divorced and remarried outside of the sacramental bond to masturbation is okay, gay sex is okay, contraception is okay, female priests are okay. I mean, the whole sort of chain of sexual teaching and power in the church, as the congregation states as its first priority, is sort of predicated on a thesis that was set forward, as Peter said, in 2014. So I do think there's a bit of a pantomime, quality to this, in which, feigning that the real problem is communication. The Vatican's poorly communicated with us in Germany. I am also cynical of this.
Yeah. Well, I want to move on. We could be here all day.
Sure.
I love Kasper complaining about doctrinal slippage. That's like Harvey Weinstein complaining about nude scenes in movies. But on Friday, Pope Francis issued a new motu proprio changing the governing law of Opus Dei, that prelature set up by John Paul II. The new letter, entitled "To Guard the Charism," transfers Vatican oversight of Opus Dei to the Congregation for Clergy from the Congregation for Bishops. Most significantly, Francis announced that the head of Opus Dei will no longer be a bishop. This change, the Pope said, is intended to strengthen the conviction that, for the protection of the particular gift of the Spirit, a form of governance based on charism, more than on hierarchical authority, is needed. Monsignor Fernando Caris, who's the current prelate of Opus Dei, was not ordained a bishop when he took office in 2017, which is out of step with his two predecessors. Your reaction here, gents, what does this mean, and what is the message attempting to be sent?
I think there's certainly more here than meets the eye. I'm still puzzling over this change myself. I've had good relationships with Opus Dei members over the years, including some priests who've given me spiritual direction. So I certainly think well of the good work that they've done and that they're doing. But it's hard not to see this as a demotion, as a kind of, make sure, Opus Dei, that you stay in your place. And you've been transferred now from the Congregation for Bishops to the Congregation for Clergy, I believe. So they've been, in a sense, demoted. Some people say that's not the case. As I point out, it's a curious thing. But I just want to mention one comment that my friend Gregory DePippo of New Liturgical Movement made. He said that it seems like sometimes Pope Francis's attitude is, I see someone with some power, that's clericalism, So if the head of Opus Dei has power, well, then that's a problem. We need to limit that. And that's been a pattern, with the Pope's dealings with all kinds of bishops around the world.
Yeah,
Chad, you want to take a stab at this?
Well, I mean, there's some speculation of a history with the Jesuit father Ghirlanda, who has a particular view that personal prelatures should not be elevated to the rank of the episcopate. And he is over 80, but he's going to be raised to the cardinalate in this next consistory. And so there's some speculation that Ghirlanda actually had a hand in this decision. The question is whether it makes any difference at all to the work. What is it doing? I think what people debate is whether or not any substantive change has occurred. As Peter said, it's not entirely clear what the bureaucratic shuffle between bishops to clergy is. Is that a downgrade? I think it's absolutely perceived as a downgrade, and it's meant to be perceived as a downgrade. Now, I think the prelate does not have to be a bishop. That does not touch the juridical structure of the work of Opus Dei. It remains hierarchical in structure, and hierarchy is what preserves the charism. So the very logic of the decision doesn't really hold up to scrutiny, because actually
Yeah.
it's still being preserved. Hierarchy and charism are being held together. I do think what it does is it sends a signal. It sends a signal that Opus Dei is affiliated with conservatives, rightly or wrongly. It's also affiliated with people recognize that it is loyal to the Pope. And so here was an opportunity to test that, to test the loyalty to the Pope. And so what was demonstrated, I think, was absolutely the filial piety of Opus Dei. Their spirituality demands it. And they exercised that filial piety in being submissive to the Holy Father. I'm not convinced it actually changes things substantively, but it does send the signal that some in the Curia would like sent.
Very quickly, lastly, photos of a shirtless priest celebrating Mass in the sea using an inflatable lounge chair went viral this week. The Italian Archdiocese of Milan has called for liturgical decorum and respect. Father Mattia Bernasconi publicly acknowledged in an interview that his choice to celebrate Mass in swim trunks was, quote, perhaps imprudent. You think, Father? The online response was titanic, to say the least. Peter, your thoughts on this?
Yes, yes. Oh, well, you know, that's a classic example of a non-apology apology. He also said, I blame myself for perhaps being a little naive. But no, I mean, what it shows is a terrible rash of desacralization that anybody could even think of getting into swim trunks and doing Mass on an inflatable raft. I mean, it's actually sacrilegious. I mean, there's no reason to mince words. And of course, he was surrounded by women in bikinis, and I mean, it was an absurdity. It was a complete absurdity and a sacrilege. So he should be much more severely disciplined than that, at least to send a signal to other people to cut out the hijinks and the tricks.
Yep. But Chad, we're back to the point I made earlier. When there is no standard, anything goes. So it just becomes a contest of innovations.
Well, and also it becomes a sort of one-way ratchet where the TLM is banned, suppressed, restricted, however you want to put it. But we have these little abuses, or rather big sacrilegious abuses, which go on, and maybe they get a wrist slap, right? But they continue. So the ratchet goes one way, continually, in a sense, trying to undo the guardrails. I think that Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict put up. Those guardrails are in the process of being dissembled, and the liturgical abuses carry on while proper liturgy gets suppressed, and everybody gets the signal. Everyone gets the message.
Well, the problem with taking down guardrails is everyone falls off the roadway before long, and that's where this seems to be headed. By the way, we should mention there is a historic number of Catholics leaving the German church. I just saw a report on this year. So these conversations have serious consequences, and I fear America could be going the same way as Europe is sliding. But we'll continue that conversation another day. Gentlemen, Chad Pecknold, Peter Kwasniewski, thank you both for being here.
Pleasure.